The courtroom smelled of polished wood and tension, a scent I would never forget. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I had been told to stay quiet, to trust my husband, to let him speak on my behalf. He had looked me in the eyes that morning, holding my hand firmly, whispering, "Just stay calm, don't say a word, trust me." I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. He had always been the one to make decisions, the one to command authority in our lives, and I had trusted him. But something about this case, this trial, felt different. It wasn't just legal, it was personal. Every word unspoken felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. The room buzzed with anticipation. Spectators, journalists, and legal assistants filled the benches, all eyes subtly drawn toward me. I could feel them analyzing, judging, questioning my very presence. The case had been sensational from the start. My husband, a prominent businessman, had been accused of fraud, and I, his wife, had been called as a key witness. Despite the pressure, I had dressed deliberately, conservative, neat, and dignified. No flamboyance, no jewelry that could distract. Just me, my voice waiting in the shadows of expectation. I wanted to speak, but I had promised to stay silent. The judge's gavel struck, echoing through the room, signaling the start of what would be a trial that would change everything. My husband stood at the defense table, confident, charming, and seemingly in control. His lawyer began, laying out a meticulous defense, weaving a narrative that painted him as misunderstood, unfairly accused by rivals. The words were slick, polished, and rehearsed. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly as he spoke until I saw the prosecutor. The prosecutor's gaze found me, not accusatory, not hostile, but probing. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He was looking for crack, for the smallest hint of truth that could unravel the story my husband and his team had constructed. I wanted to shrink into my chair, to hide behind my husband, but I remained rigid, my hands folded neatly in my lap. The questioning began. He asked about financial records, meetings, transactions, each question carefully structured to imply complicity or awareness. My husband had warned me not to respond, to let him handle it, and I did. I stayed silent, but as the hours wore on, I watched the courtroom dynamics shift. Friends and family on the other side of the room whispered, exchanged glances, some nodding, others shaking their heads. My silence, once assumed to be obedience, began to be interpreted as uncertainty, then suspicion. The more I stayed quiet, the more weight my presence carried, like a storm gathering silently behind calm eyes. Then came the moment that changed everything. My husband, standing to deliver his closing argument, looked at me, and I caught a flicker in his eyes. Confidence? Or something else, fear, perhaps. He assumed my silence was loyalty, but I realized something he hadn't anticipated. Loyalty had a limit. When faced with the potential of injustice, silence could no longer serve me, or the truth. The judge, an imposing figure with silver hair and a steady gaze, listened intently as my husband spoke. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word. And then the judge did something unexpected, something that caused my stomach to twist and my heartbeat to accelerate. "Mrs. Emerson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "UV remained silent throughout these proceedings, but I am now giving you the opportunity to speak. I will ask the final question. This is your moment to clarify your testimony, or remain silent at your own discretion." Time seemed to freeze. My husband's eyes widened slightly, a shadow of panic crossing his face. My heart pounded so loudly that I feared it might echo in the room. The weight of the moment pressed on me suddenly. The decision wasn't about trust or obedience. It was about truth, integrity, and reclaiming my own voice. The judge leaned slightly forward, his eyes piercing. "Mrs. Emerson," he said, "did you have knowledge of, or participate in, any activities that violated the law in connection with your husband's business dealings?" The room held its breath. My husband's hands tightened on the edge of the table. His lawyer glanced at me nervously, mouthing words I couldn't hear, pleading silently for compliance, for silence. But my mind had already made a decision. This was my moment, not his, not theirs, mine. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the tension uncoil just slightly. I looked the judge in the eye and spoke, my voice steady, clear, and unwavering. I was aware of some actions, but I did not participate, and I refused to remain complicit when I realized the implications. I did not stay silent because of loyalty, but because I feared for what might happen if I spoke out sooner. Today, I am choosing to tell the truth. A murmur ran through the courtroom. My husband's face drained of color. Shock, disbelief, and rage flickered across his features. The prosecutor's expression shifted from anticipation to cautious curiosity. The judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the weight of my words without interruption. The narrative had shifted instantly. My testimony, spoken at this pivotal moment, reframed the entire case. It wasn't just the content, it was the timing, the courage, and the defiance of the silence I had been ordered to maintain. The power dynamics in the room had changed irreversibly. I could feel eyes on me, some with respect, others with judgment, but it didn't matter. I had reclaimed my voice. The truth, finally, was no longer muted by fear or manipulation. And for the first time in this long, exhausting ordeal, I felt free not just from the pressure of obedience, but from the shadow of my husband's control. The gavel struck again, signaling a brief recess, and whispers of speculation filled the room. People turned to one another, trying to interpret what had just happened. My heart still raced, but I knew, deep down, that this was the moment that would define not only the trial, but the rest of my life. I had been told to stay quiet, to defer to my husband's authority, but I had chosen differently. And that choice, in the face of fear and expectation, would become my most powerful act of defiance and courage. The courtroom had barely settled after my declaration when whispers began circulating like wildfire. Every eye seemed to be on me, every movement analyzed, every gesture dissected. I could feel the weight of judgment pressing down, but for the first time, I also felt a surge of control. I had chosen to speak, and that choice was mine alone. My husband sat frozen, his usual composure shattered. The confident, commanding man who had guided our lives with certainty now looked like a stranger. I caught the subtle twitch of his fingers gripping the edge of the table, his jaw tight. His lawyer glanced nervously between him and me, clearly realizing that the carefully orchestrated narrative had shifted dramatically in a matter of seconds. The prosecutor rose, adjusting his tie, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Mrs. Emerson," he said, his voice both professional and encouraging, "thank you for your honesty. Could you clarify exactly what you were aware of, and at what point you realized you could not remain silent?" I took another slow breath, steadying myself. The question was loaded, but I had anticipated it. I became aware of irregular financial transactions and misleading statements within the company about 2 years ago. I initially tried to ignore it, hoping it was a misunderstanding. But as the evidence accumulated, I realized the magnitude of the deception. I spoke to my husband privately, urging him to rectify the situation. When he dismissed my concerns and asked me to remain quiet, I felt trapped between loyalty and legality. Ultimately, I could not allow myself to be complicit in wrongdoing. That is why I am here today, telling the truth. The room was silent, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I could feel the tension, the shifting energy, as every person in the courtroom absorbed the weight of what I had just said. My husband's face had gone pale, and I could see the anger simmering behind his eyes. He had expected my silence to shield him, to maintain the carefully curated image he had built over decades. Instead, my words had cracked that facade. The judge, a composed and discerning woman, leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Emerson, your courage is noted. This court will take your testimony under careful consideration. You understand, however, that your decision to speak may have consequences, both personal and legal." I nodded. I had expected that. Consequences were part of taking a stand. Fear had once dictated my behavior, but now clarity guided it. "I understand, Your Honor," I replied, my voice unwavering. The prosecution continued to question me, drilling into specifics of dates, financial records, and meetings. Each time I answered truthfully, with detail and precision. I had spent weeks preparing, reviewing documents, and rehearsing potential questions. My husband's attempts to intimidate me, both overtly and subtly, had only strengthened my resolve. I was no longer the silent, compliant wife he expected me to be. Outside the courtroom, the repercussions were immediate. Reporters had been tipped off to the pivotal moment, and by the time the lunch recess arrived, the story had begun to circulate online. Headlines read variations of "Key Witness Defies," "Husband in High-Stakes Trial and Wife Breaks Silence, Alters Case Trajectory." Social media was alive with speculation, praise, and criticism. Some called me brave, others accused me of betrayal. But the noise didn't matter. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my voice and set the truth into motion. Returning to the courtroom, I noticed subtle changes in the demeanor of those around me. Witnesses for the prosecution were now more willing to speak, their fear of my husband's influence lessened by my demonstration of courage. Even the jury seemed to lean forward slightly, paying closer attention, their eyes no longer just scanning documents but observing me, analyzing my expressions, and measuring my sincerity. My husband, sensing the shift, attempted to regain control. He rose to make a statement, his voice firm, authoritative. "Members of the jury," he began, "I assure you, my wife's testimony has been misinterpreted. She acted impulsively, without understanding the context of our business decisions. I ask you to consider the full picture." I could see the judge's eyes narrow subtly, her patience measured but finite. My husband's confidence, once so unshakable, was visibly eroding. His lawyer whispered urgently, reminding him of protocol, of strategy. But it was too late. The momentum had shifted irrevocably. During a brief recess later that afternoon, I stepped into the hallway, where reporters and spectators had gathered. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and a chorus of questions began. "Mrs. Emerson, what made you finally speak?" one reporter asked. I paused, considering my words carefully. "Fear doesn't define us," I said clearly. "Silence doesn't protect us. And loyalty, when it comes at the expense of truth, is not loyalty at all, it is complicity." I chose to speak because it was the right thing to do, not because it was easy, or safe, or convenient. Her words reverberated through the media, amplifying the story far beyond the courtroom walls. By the time we returned, the narrative had already begun to shape public perception. I could sense that my husband's carefully constructed reputation was beginning to crack, not because of the legal evidence alone, but because of the moral clarity I had brought into the room. The afternoon session resumed, with the prosecution presenting additional evidence, cross-referencing my testimony with financial records, emails, and internal reports. Each piece aligned with the timeline I had described, reinforcing the credibility of my statements. My husband's defense team scrambled to adjust, but it was too late. The foundation of their case relying on my silence had been shattered. By evening, it was clear that my decision to speak had transformed the dynamics of the trial. Observers whispered about the improbability of the shift, the courage required, and the tactical brilliance behind the timing of my testimony. Even the court staff, who had grown accustomed to procedural monotony, paused to acknowledge the impact of my words. As the day ended, I returned home, exhausted but resolute. My husband was waiting, a mixture of frustration and disbelief etched across his face. "Why did you do that?" he demanded, his voice low and controlled, yet tinged with panic. "You've ruined everything. You should have trusted me." I met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No," I said firmly. "I trusted myself. I trusted the truth. And I refused to be complicit in wrongdoing any longer. You may have power, but it is hollow when built on fear and silence." He opened his mouth to respond, but I turned and walked away. That night, I lay awake, reflecting on the day's events. The courtroom had been more than a venue for legal proceedings. It had been a crucible, testing my courage, my integrity, and my willingness to defy expectations. I had emerged stronger, more aware, and more determined to see justice done. And while the trial was far from over, one fact had become undeniable. The power to shape outcomes did not lie solely in titles, money, or influence. It lay in truth, courage, and the willingness to stand when it mattered most. The morning of the third day of the trial arrived like a storm waiting to break. I could feel it in the air, charged, heavy, and full of expectation. The courtroom seemed even more crowded than the day before, with reporters, legal analysts, and curious spectators eager to witness what had become a sensational trial. My husband, once so poised, now moved with a subtle tension, like a predator aware of a trap closing in around him. The judge entered, her presence commanding silence, and the court resumed. Today, the prosecutor had something new, a set of documents and emails that had been obtained through careful investigation and, in part, corroborated by my testimony from the previous day. Each page was like a hammer striking at the carefully built walls of deception. As the first exhibit was presented, I recognized the handwriting on a memo, the phrasing of a directive I had once glanced at in passing. It was from my husband, instructing his team to manipulate certain reports to appear legitimate to auditors. My stomach knotted, but I didn't flinch. I had anticipated this. I had spent nights reviewing these documents, memorizing details, and preparing for every possible question. The prosecutor looked at me, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Mrs. Emerson, can you confirm the authenticity of these documents?" I nodded. "These are real. I've seen these memos, and I recognize the emails. They accurately reflect the instructions given by my husband to his team." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The defense team exchanged hurried whispers, their previous confidence slipping like sand through fingers. My husband's face was pale, eyes darting between me and the judge. The realization of exposure was slowly sinking in. Then came the crucial moment the prosecutor asked me to explain why, despite seeing these instructions, I had not acted sooner. It was a delicate question, one that could cast me as complicit or negligent if handled poorly. But I had rehearsed this answer, understanding that perception could sway the jury as much as fact. "I was afraid," I admitted, my voice steady. "I feared for my own safety and for my career. I had trusted that issues could be resolved internally, but when I realized the magnitude of the misconduct and my husband's unwillingness to correct it, I understood that silence was no longer an option. I could not be complicit, even if it meant personal consequences." The courtroom remained silent for a long moment. My husband's lips pressed into a thin line, his usual arrogance replaced by a hard, calculating panic. Even his lawyer seemed momentarily shaken, realizing that my credibility had become a force that could not be countered easily. The prosecution then shifted to another line of questioning, one that I had feared might come: the testimony of employees who had been coerced or manipulated by my husband's directives. Witnesses were called, and each story corroborated what I had stated. They spoke of subtle threats, promised bonuses contingent on silence, and the pervasive atmosphere of fear that had infiltrated the company. Listening to them, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Vindication because the truth was finally emerging. Sorrow because so many had suffered under my husband's decisions, often silently, as I had done. I realized that speaking out was not just an act of defiance, it was a responsibility. I had the chance to give voice to others who had been silent. The afternoon session brought a bombshell. The prosecutor introduced financial transactions that had been carefully hidden, showing the flow of funds into accounts that were untraceable to legitimate business operations. When asked to comment, I explained what I had seen and the moments I had confronted my husband. Each time he had dismissed concerns, framing them as misunderstandings or routine procedures. The judge leaned forward, her piercing gaze fixed on my husband. "Mr. Emerson, how do you respond to these allegations? Are you denying the evidence and testimony presented, including that of your spouse?" His voice, once smooth and controlled, now wavered. "Your Honor, there must be a misunderstanding. My wife has misinterpreted internal communications." A wave of disbelief washed over the courtroom. The prosecutor shook his head subtly, indicating that the claim was implausible. I could see the cracks in my husband's composure widen. The jury, attentive and analytical, seemed to lean forward in reaction, silently judging the credibility of each speaker. Then came the most harrowing part, the testimony that would later be described in media reports as the turning point. The prosecutor asked me to describe a specific meeting, one where critical decisions had been made and where I had been directly confronted with unethical instructions. I recounted it, describing the words, the tone, and the threats implied. I could see my husband's hands tighten on the edge of the table, knuckles white. The courtroom felt taut, as if holding its collective breath. At that moment, I realized something profound. My husband had underestimated me. He believed my silence equaled obedience, that my compliance was guaranteed. But what he hadn't accounted for was resilience, the strength that grows quietly in the shadow of fear, and the determination that crystallizes when one understands that truth cannot be compromised. The judge paused, reflecting on my words. Mrs. Emerson, your testimony is detailed and compelling. It appears you have maintained an accurate recollection of events and have provided context that the court finds credible. The jury will be instructed to weigh your testimony alongside other evidence. The afternoon session ended with a sense of inevitability. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, eager to capture the story. Headlines began forming even before the trial adjourned. Wife breaks silence, exposes hidden misconduct, and key testimony shakes husband's case. Social media buzzed with speculation, admiration, and outrage. The narrative had shifted, and the momentum was now on my side. Returning home that evening, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. My husband sat across from me, a mask of controlled anger. "You've destroyed me," he said quietly, almost a whisper. I met his gaze calmly. "No," I replied. IV revealed the truth. That is not destruction, it is justice. Silence was never the answer. And now, we will see the consequences of actions finally catching up with you. For the first time, I felt the weight of empowerment. Speaking had consequences, yes, but it also unleashed a force that could not be contained. The truth had a momentum of its own, and it was moving fast. That night, I lay awake, thinking about the path that had brought me here. Fear had once dictated my choices. Obedience had once been my default. But courage, deliberate and unwavering, had changed everything. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I knew one thing with certainty. The trial was far from over, and the most significant revelations were still ahead. The morning of the fourth day of the trial arrived, with a tense energy that was almost palpable. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a chasm filled with truth, lies, and consequences. I could feel the courtroom vibrating with anticipation. Reporters were already camped outside, live updates streaming in, while inside, every participant seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next revelation. My husband arrived, his posture stiff and controlled, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a subtle tremor in his hands. Gone was the smug confidence of earlier days. Gone was the assumption that his power would shield him. Today, he was on trial in more ways than one, not just legally, but morally, socially, and publicly. The judge called the court to order. "We will begin with witness testimony and a review of all communications relevant to this case," she announced, her tone leaving no room for delay. The first witness called was someone I had anticipated would be pivotal, James Parker, the company's former financial officer. He had been silent for months, too intimidated to speak, but my courage had ignited a spark of defiance in others. His testimony was measured, precise, and damning. "Mr. Parker," the prosecutor asked, "can you confirm whether you were directed to alter reports and conceal certain financial transactions?" James cleared his throat, his voice firm now. "I was instructed to manipulate report, to hide discrepancies that would have alerted auditors. I felt pressured because of the fear of repercussions, but it was clear that these instructions came directly from Mr. Emerson." The courtroom reacted immediately, whispered comments, and the subtle shaking of my husband's head. His lawyer tried to interject, but the judge held up a hand, one at a time. "Mr. Parker, please continue." He went on to describe meetings, emails, and conversations, each detail corroborating my earlier testimony. It was as if a wall of deception was crumbling brick by brick, each story reinforcing the narrative of intentional wrongdoing. My husband's hands trembled on the table now, his knuckles white. I could see the realization in his eyes. The house of cards he had built over decades was collapsing. Then the prosecutor turned to me. "Mrs. Emerson, would you like to elaborate on the impact of these actions, personally and professionally?" I took a deep breath, steadying my emotions. Yes, these actions forced me into silence for years, creating fear and self-doubt. They damaged employees' morale, compromised the integrity of the company, and ultimately eroded trust. On a personal level, my autonomy and voice were suppressed. I was made to feel insignificant, to believe my concerns were trivial. But by speaking now, I am reclaiming not only my voice, but also the accountability that was long overdue. The judge nodded slowly, her gaze assessing me with measured respect. Your testimony is duly noted. The next segment of the trial involved the presentation of the most explosive evidence, hidden communications between my husband and a series of shell companies. Screenshots, financial statements, and emails flashed on the monitors for the jury, media, and spectators to see. The implications were clear: embezzlement, fraud, and a deliberate attempt to conceal wealth and mislead shareholders. I could see my husband's face pale as each document was presented. His lawyer tried to argue technicalities, claiming misinterpretations or clerical errors, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. Every step, every manipulation, every attempt at concealment had been traced back, often confirmed by my own prior knowledge and documentation. Finally, the prosecution asked the question that would define the turning point. Mrs. Emerson, when you realized the scope of these actions, what prevented you from leaving the company immediately or reporting it sooner? I met the jury's eyes, steady and unwavering. Fear. Fear for my livelihood, my safety, and the consequences of speaking out in a world that often values wealth and power over truth. But once I understood the full scope and the harm it was causing, remaining silent was no longer an option. Speaking was not only necessary, it was imperative. There was a shift in the courtroom. The tension was replaced by a focused attentiveness. The jury, previously reserved, leaned in. Spectators murmured in acknowledgement. My husband's composure, once unshakable, had fully eroded. His face showed defeat, not in the sense of legal loss yet, but in the realization that his moral standing was gone. Then came the final personal confrontation, the moment I had anticipated with a mixture of dread and determination. The judge, looking at both of us, asked a question that seemed to echo in the room. Mr. Emerson, given the testimony of your spouse and other key witnesses, how do you respond to the claim that your actions constitute deliberate misconduct and a breach of fiduciary responsibility? My husband opened his mouth, struggled for words, faltered, and finally stammered, I don't, The judge's eyes narrowed. You may want to reconsider your answer carefully. The court requires clarity and accountability. He swallowed hard, his voice shaking. I cannot dispute that there were errors, but my intentions were not malicious. I was trying to protect the company. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed my face. Protecting the company? After years of manipulation, deceit, and silence? The words were hollow, empty shells compared to the reality of the evidence laid bare in the courtroom. The judge turned to me, her gaze piercing. Mrs. Emerson, if you were to summarize in one sentence the significance of your testimony and the evidence presented, what would it be? I inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Your Honor, I said, my voice firm and unwavering, this case demonstrates that silence and compliance allow wrongdoing to flourish. Speaking the truth is not betrayal, it is justice. No one, regardless of wealth, influence, or personal relationships, is above accountability. The room seemed to exhale collectively. My husband's face had gone ashen, his jaw tight. He realized that my voice, once quiet and overshadowed, had become the instrument that reshaped the course of the trial. The impact was undeniable. The narrative had shifted. The momentum was mine, and the world was watching. As the day ended, the courtroom emptied, leaving a charged stillness in its wake. Outside, reporters swarmed, eager to capture every detail of what had transpired. Social media was ablaze with commentary. Headlines reflected the moment perfectly. Wife's courage shakes billion-dollar company trial, and silence broken, truth exposed. Key testimony alters case trajectory. Returning home, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. The day had been exhausting, yes, but it had been decisive. I had not only spoken the truth, I had reshaped the narrative, challenged a culture of fear, and demonstrated that courage could alter the course of power. My husband was silent, his eyes avoiding mine. He had expected submission, compliance, and quiet obedience. Instead, he faced an unwavering moral force that could not be intimidated. And as I lay in bed that night, I realized something profound. The trial was no longer just about legal consequences. It was about reclaiming agency and dignity. For the first time in years, I felt free not because the trial had concluded, but because I had spoken, and in doing so, had begun to reclaim my life. And in the quiet moments before sleep took me, I resolved that the next day, the final act, would be mine to shape. The fifth day of the trial dawned with an air of inevitability. After 4 days of testimony, documents, and witness statements, it felt like the tide had turned irrevocably. Today was the day that everything, the truth, the lies, the fear, and the courage would converge in the courtroom. I had spent a restless night reviewing key points, preparing my final words, and steeling myself for the culmination of a journey that had begun with whispers of betrayal and ended in a fight for justice. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation when I arrived. Reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public packed the room, cameras capturing every movement, every expression. My husband sat across from me, his posture rigid, his face pale. The confidence that had once shielded him was gone. In its place, I saw desperation, a silent recognition that the fortress he had built over years was crumbling under the weight of truth. The judge entered, bringing the room to immediate silence. She looked over the gathered parties, her gaze lingering briefly on me, then on my husband. Today, we will hear closing arguments, review critical evidence, and allow testimony that addresses the heart of this case. Let us proceed with the utmost focus and attention. The prosecutor began, summarizing the key evidence, the emails and memos that documented intentional misconduct, the witnesses who testified to manipulation and coercion, and my own testimony detailing how the deception had been orchestrated and concealed. Every word reinforced what the court had already begun to see. The pattern of wrongdoing was systematic, deliberate, and undeniable. When it was my turn to speak, I felt a calm wash over me. I walked to the stand, paused for a moment to look at the jury, and began. Your Honor, members of the jury, I said, my voice clear and steady. This case is not only about financial misconduct, it is about accountability, integrity, and courage. For too long, people have believed that wealth and influence can shield one from responsibility. For too long, fear has silenced those who know the truth. Today, we have an opportunity to affirm that no one is above the law, no one is above justice, and no one is above moral accountability. I continued, detailing the sequence of events from my first awareness of the misconduct to the day I had finally decided to speak. I emphasized not only the fact, but also the human element, the fear, the hesitation, and ultimately, the determination to stand up for what was right. The jury listened intently, their eyes never leaving me. I felt the gravity of the moment, but also a strange liberation. Speaking had always been my responsibility, but now it felt like a mission fulfilled, a vow honored. The defense tried to counter with technicalities, minor inconsistencies, and claims of misinterpretation, but their arguments were weak against the weight of irrefutable evidence. The court had seen documents, listened to witnesses, and absorbed my testimony. Their attempts to undermine the narrative were transparent, desperate, and ultimately ineffective. Then came the critical moment. The judge asked the question that would define the verdict. She turned to my husband, her voice firm, carrying the authority that had governed this courtroom throughout the trial. Mr. Emerson, given the testimony, evidence, and witness accounts presented over these past days, do you acknowledge your actions, and are you prepared to accept the consequences? My husband's face went pale. His lips moved, forming words that barely reached the courtroom. The judge's gaze was unwavering. Speak clearly. I cannot accept that I did anything wrong, he finally stammered, his voice brittle and shaky. The room responded with a mixture of disbelief and murmured commentary. The prosecutor leaned forward. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. We request that the court proceed with judgment based on documented action, corroborated testimonies, and legal precedent. The judge nodded, Turning to the jury, members of the jury, you have heard the testimony, reviewed the evidence, and weighed the argument. You must now deliberate on whether the defendant's actions constitute intentional misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and deliberate deception. The jury filed out, leaving a charged silence in the courtroom. My husband sat rigid, his face a mask of anxiety. I remained calm, though my heart beat rapidly beneath the surface. I had done everything within my power to ensure that the truth was presented, the evidence revealed, and justice pursued. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict, and spoke with clarity and authority. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts of intentional misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and deliberate deception. We recommend restitution to affected parties and appropriate legal consequences in accordance with the law. The words struck the courtroom like a lightning bolt. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. My husband's face went white, his shoulders slumping. The weight of accountability had finally reached him. The judge addressed the court, her voice steady. Let it be known that justice has been served. The court acknowledges the bravery of witnesses, particularly those who overcame fear to speak the truth. Sentencing will be scheduled accordingly. As the gavel came down, a sense of release and vindication washed over me. The long, grueling journey, the fear, the hesitation, the moments of doubt, had culminated in justice. My voice, once silenced, had been heard, and it had made a difference. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was immediate. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and social media exploded with coverage. I stepped forward, addressing the gathered press. I want to say this, I began, my voice calm but resonant. Justice is not always easy. Speaking up is not always safe, but it is necessary. We all have a responsibility to stand for what is right, even when it feels impossible. Today, truth has prevailed, and I hope it inspires others to find their courage. The statement made waves, resonating with people across the city, the state, and beyond. Messages of support, admiration, and gratitude flooded in. Many shared their own stories of fear and silence, finding strength in my actions. I realized that the impact of speaking the truth extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. In the days that followed, my life shifted. I was no longer seen as merely the spouse of a powerful figure. I was recognized as an individual with integrity, courage, and moral authority. The company my husband had once controlled was now under new management, with policies ensuring transparency, accountability, and respect for employees. I had helped guide that transition, ensuring that the lessons of the trial were embedded in the organization's culture. More importantly, I had reclaimed my own life. Fear no longer dictated my choices. Silence no longer defined my identity. I had faced the storm, spoken the truth, and emerged stronger, wiser, and empowered. And as I looked back on the path that had brought me here, the whispers, the humiliation, the internal battles, I understood that the journey had not only been about justice for the wrongdoing, but also about personal transformation. Courage had been my guide, integrity my compass, and truth my weapon. In the quiet moments I reflected on the journey, the fear that had once held me captive, the moments of doubt that had threatened to derail me, and the eventual triumph that had been achieved, not through vengeance, but through unwavering commitment to what was right. I had learned that speaking up, even when it felt impossible, could change the course of lives, not just mine, but those around me. And in that realization, I found not only justice, but peace, purpose, and a new beginning.